It's the week ending Saturday, the 26th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen same-sex marriage and abortion legalised in Northern Ireland, 39 people's bodies found in a lorry container in Essex, and Boris Johnson's Brexit bill passed in its second reading. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And after our all-female lineup last week, it is a gentleman's club today, as I am joined from the week's digital team by Cameron Tait, Gabriel Power, and the boss man, Holden Frith. And starting the show this week is Gabriel. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
While Justin Trudeau clings to power, Quebec is having a block party.
People of Quebec and Canada have chosen a minority parliament tonight. No party among those who were aspiring to a majority won a majority of seats. No party will control the House of Commons. In Quebec, the Bloc Québécois does not want to form a government or even participate in a government.
That was Yves-François Blanchet speaking at Montreal's National Theatre earlier in the week. So, Gabriel, it's a Canadian election story, which you could hardly say has been underreported, especially to people listening in Canada. But what's the bit that hasn't got the attention it deserves?
The bit that hasn't got the attention it deserves is Quebec, which, while the rest of the country seems split between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party, Quebec opted for the Bloc Québécois.
Who are they?
The Bloc Québécois are a fairly left-wing separatist party that formed in the early 90s. And the resurgence of them in Quebec this week is a little confusing for a number of reasons, because the appetite for independence at the moment is actually quite low. So it's left a lot of pundits scratching their heads as to why everybody's gone and voted for the Bloc.
And the obvious comparison I was making internally when I was reading these stories, Holden, is with the SNP. As Gabriel says, Bloc Québécois are left-wing nationalists, and we know that Trudeau was affected by a lot of his vote going over to other parties. So you wonder whether, if you're a sort of liberal-minded person, you vote for them out of desperation, really, much like some Labour voters in Scotland voted for the SNP.
There's a few parallels here, and one is that after the independence referendum, the SNP talked much less about independence and more about governing Scotland, and the Bloc Québécois has done something similar in Canada, where it's been even more explicit, in fact, of saying it's not going to push for separatism and really is talking about local government and environmentalism and some of those sorts of themes that might appeal to disaffected Trudeau voters. The one slight wrinkle is that while the party has had this sort of leftist progressive history, it does also seem to have been moving slightly more in a populist direction in this election cycle. A few of its candidates have been exposed as having posted anti-Islam material on Twitter, and it's also embraced a piece of legislation called Bill 21, which bans teachers, judges, other civil servants from wearing religious symbolism, and that's seems to have been targeting particularly Muslims.
Do you think, though, Gabriel, that'll put off their voters? Because in a way, you know, if you're appealing both to left and right, this could be what is making this party more mainstream again.
The Bloc's position on a lot of issues is very much symbolic of Quebec as a whole. It's very, very torn. So on the one hand, you have, as we said, the Bloc Québécois, who are left-wing, socialist, fairly socialist, pro-equality and, you know, fixing the gender pay gap and all that sort of stuff. But then at the same time, they have adhered and supported Bill 21. And Quebec, although it's voted for this left-wing party, and the remainder of Quebec has voted for either Liberal or NDP, New Democratic Party, with only a small amount going to them and the Conservatives. Quebec has its own National Assembly as well, and that voted in 2018 for a right-wing party known as the Coalition Avenir Québec, which implemented Bill 21. So at the federal level, Bloc Québécois, I think, gained a lot of support because it supported the idea that Quebecers really don't like being told what to do by the federal government, which is something that Trudeau did. He spoke out against Bill 21, and even if, the rest of the world sees it as a terrible piece of legislation, Quebecers don't like being told that it's bad legislation or that they're racist or that they're doing something wrong. But at the same time, they do vote for these fairly far-right parties in their provincial elections.
And we're here to discuss what the repercussions are for the rest of us as well. When we look at these international stories, Cameron, you do wonder what this actually teaches us. Is this about the tide of nationalism not going anywhere and it's affecting all Western countries? Or is this going to have repercussions for us because it does actually make the separation of Quebec slightly more likely than it was before, and we'd end up with two separate countries there?
I would say on the latter point, it does, because, this has been a hot topic for decades. But while on the surface, the Bloc says that it's not planning to call for the separation of Quebec and Canada, they make it explicitly clear that they want to work with Canada. What I get the impression of is in this sense is it's almost like just opening the door somewhat and then putting your foot in it. Their number of seats jumped from 10 to 32, so that it was quite a sizable push that they had. I kind of think it could open the possibility of it in the future.
And what would that look like for Quebec and all of its neighbours if there was independence there, if that actually became a real possibility? Is it going to be as much of a shambles as Brexit?
No, I don't think it would be anything like Brexit. Quebec would be more prepared. They've had two referenda, one in 1980 and one in 1995, both of which were only narrowly defeated. The second one was incredibly close.
Yeah, 1% or something.
Yeah, really, like within 60,000 votes. It was with a voter turnout of 93%. So it really was close. But I feel like, the implementation of borders would obviously, and immigration limits and quotas and all that sort of thing would take a lot of legislation to deal with. But I feel like they're much more prepared than we were. Because the thing is, when it comes to Brexit, a lot of people, or actually no, pretty much everyone didn't know what they were voting for, really. Whereas Quebecers do.
And I loved the way, by the way, that the collective noun is Quebecers. Did we all know that before today?
That is definitely something that I learned while researching this.
It's a great word, don't you think? Je suis un Quebecer.
No. Well, if you're in French, then you are Québécois. That's the French version of Quebecer, I believe.
I do wonder whether the French language, being the language of Quebec, is one of the reasons that Quebecan, if that is the correct term, politics goes slightly underreported in the UK and in the US, indeed, is because actually you can't Google it.
It's much harder to make that leap, I think, and it's harder to draw the parallels because I think it almost feels to outsiders as if it is a self-contained community already, and I think it probably does draw some of its strength from that. And alongside the political agenda of the Bloc Québécois, it does also have a very strong mission to defend the French language and to ensure that the Canadian federal government is also respectful of the French language. And actually, I think in the shorter term, that's an area where we're likely to see more consequences because Justin Trudeau didn't win a majority. He's 13 seats short in the Canadian House of Commons. And so the Bloc Québécois' 32 seats could hold the balance of power there. So they're likely to want some quid pro quo in return for their support on his agenda.
I feel like the Bloc Québécois, realistically, it's not anything that they ran on that has given them a huge boost. It's the unpopularity of Justin Trudeau, because the parties that they tend to vote for, as we've already said, are fairly left-wing or liberal, at least centre-left. So they were never going to go for the Conservatives. Trudeau is fairly unpopular because he puts his nose in Quebecois internal politics, and the NDP, for some reason, just could not gain any ground from their very kind of ultra-progressive platform. Whereas in 2011, NDP swept Quebec. And so there clearly is an appetite for left-wing politics there. In the void left by the unpopularity by Trudeau, the NDP have just vanished, and I don't know why.
And here's another word that we're all learning this week, or I am anyway, Wexit. Anyone care to explain what that is?
Recent polls have shown that there's a real sense of disillusionment in the western provinces of Canada, in the so-called prairies. You're looking at Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and not so much BC, but particularly Alberta. Now, Alberta currently, there are more people supporting independence for Alberta than independence for Quebec. So there have been polls recently showing...
that you just don't hear about, do you?
No, not at all. Because, a lot of people outside of Canada have heard of Quebec because of its uniqueness, because it's francophone and it's it's got a bunch of very controversial laws. But Alberta is just another kind of very rural province. It's very conservative traditionally. It's the conservative stronghold.
There is a mechanism by which increasing Quebecan nationalism could precipitate an even greater movement towards independence in Alberta and Western Canada, because one of the policy areas in which the Bloc is likely to try and push Trudeau is to limit the expansion of oil pipelines across Canada, its history being very pro-environmental legislation. But the area with the biggest oil is Alberta. And so the Albertan independence movement is actually very pro-oil exploitation and transportation. And so if you get a situation where Quebec is forcing the federal government to step in and stop oil pipelines, that's going to mean a lot of angry Albertans who are more likely to resist. There's also a personal element to it, which is that Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was the prime minister who effectively nationalised the oil profits. So whereas previously Albertan government had been able to use all of that money for itself, that now gets redistributed away from Alberta to the poorer provinces in Canada. So he's not a popular man to start with.
And how's the rest of Canada actually responding to this rise of the Nationalist Party in Quebec?
Well, a lot of provincial governors and provinces have expressed their displeasure, either explicitly or implicitly, with Quebec because they feel like they're being pandered to, because 25% of the Canadian population speaks French, and yet 2 of the 3 prime ministerial debates leading up to the election were conducted in French. And, they gave way too much airtime to Maxime Bernier, who is a Quebec native who runs the People's Party of Canada, which is like a far-right fringe group. And then, I just feel like a lot of people think that Quebec is being overrepresented and being overly protected by legislation and by prime ministers unwilling to speak out against their controversial laws.
I suppose, in the words of the famous French-Canadian Céline Dion, they think Quebec should think twice. Holden, you're up next after this. Okay, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It's not just Asians getting crazy rich.
It's Friday night in Beijing, and the rich young things have come out to play. In the 1970s, you could be killed here by a mob for showing outward displays of wealth. Now, barely legal drivers can be seen behind the wheels of $600,000 sports cars. Within 10 years, half the world's billionaires will come from China. While other countries are in panic mode over their stagnant economies, here they're making money and they're flaunting it.
A clip from Journeyman TV's YouTube channel. So, Holden, we're talking about Chinese billionaires, which sounds like a biscuit, but what is the story?
The story comes from Credit Suisse, which published its latest global wealth report on Monday. This provides a snapshot, really, of where all the world's money is, and increasingly, it's in China. That clip was actually a few years old and was celebrating, or at least marking, the fact that there were 1 million millionaires in China. This report says there's now 4.4 million of them, wow. And that's up from pretty much none in the year 2000. There were really only a handful then. So this is a sort of profound shift in China. But the number of millionaires throughout the world is actually rising. And the reason I think this matters is that the unequal distribution of wealth has been a sort of rumbling political sore, really, since the financial crisis. And with the Democratic primary in the States and with the prospect of a general election between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn here, I think this is something we're going to hear a lot more about.
Yeah, so Credit Suisse claim that the wealthiest 10% of people have 82% of the world's wealth, whilst the bottom half account for less than 1%. So despite all the political rhetoric there's already been on this, there's no significant shift in the dial here, is there?
Well, I think part of the reason this report hasn't actually cut through is that it's a really complicated picture it paints. And
who'd have thought global economics was complicated?
It doesn't quite fit anybody's political take on it. So the statistic you've just given shows how unequal wealth is around the world. But actually that is a profound shift in the favour of the poorest 1% over the past 10 years.
How so?
Well, what you see is that although inequality is rising within most countries, inequality between countries is actually falling. So poorer countries are getting richer faster than richer countries are. And at the same time, you're seeing the richest 1% of all individuals now holding slightly less of the world's wealth than they did over the past 3 years. And yet there is still this feeling that inequality is rising. And that's a narrative that's kind of coloured a lot of political debate. And while that's true in the US, in the UK, it actually depends quite a lot on which measures you use. And by one measure, the UK is really unequal, but getting better, and by the other measure, it's relatively equal, but getting worse.
Yeah, reading the Credit Suisse report, for a bonus point, anybody can enter this. Does anyone have to hand or remember the amount of savings one requires to be considered in the top 10% of the world's richest people?
I
Cameron,
do actually,
go on.
yes. It's $109,430.
Exactly right. 83 grand. £83,630, which I imagine is making many listeners to this wonder why they're not spending more money on Bollinger if they're actually in the world's top 10% for having 83 grand in the bank.
It's not that... not as much as I was thinking, actually. I was expecting it to be kind of in the 500,000s of enough to qualify you to own a Coots card.
Well, this is it, isn't it? So lifestyles come into play. You know, depending on what country you live in. I'm not saying having 83 grand in the bank isn't a lot of money, but obviously it's not enough to buy yourself a house, never mind a Bentley. So, you know, in this country, you're not going to be having a lifestyle that makes you feel like you're in the top 10% of the world's richest.
Yeah, what's obscure about this as well is that, I mean, defining wealth is incredibly hard, because if you take savings, you could literally scrape by on life. But if you have quite a high income and you put it all into a savings account, therefore you're wealthy. But if you have millions in assets, but you maybe only hold 50 grand in savings, I don't really know how that would work. I don't have anywhere near that kind of money, but you wouldn't be classed as one of the wealthy. So I find that quite obscure.
This is one of the issues that clouds the debate about inequality in the UK, is whether you're talking about income inequality, so, you know, salary, benefits, other sources of cash, or you're talking about wealth inequality, which is, you know, adding up all of the assets you own, which may include a house, pension savings, other investments, and then subtracting debts, mortgage, credit card, etc.
But it is fairly clear, isn't it, that millennials are the worst off age group, he says, turning to Gabriel, who I presume is a millennial by most definitions. He's wearing an AOC T-shirt, which you just pointed to.
I know, I'm just a walking stereotype, walking cliche.
Fine. Do you find that amongst your peer group that, you know, you can exemplify the evidence here that, you know, basically your friends are never going to be able to afford properties, essentially, until their parents die or pass it on to them?
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% the case. I mean, I feel like I'm not really in a position to talk, considering I live in London and have a stable job, so I don't feel like I can complain too much. But salaries have stagnated for so long, it's particularly since the 2008 financial crisis, while inflation has gone up.
Exactly. And this is the generation that paid to go to university and then entered the workplace as salaries stagnated.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing I would say is that although we are looking at the 10%, we say that the 10% is being in the top 10% means you only need like a small amount of money, or you need a small amount of money to be in the top 10%. The top 10% still control 82% of the world's wealth. So that's a lot.
And what about China specifically? What is actually accounting for more millionaires there? I mean, obviously, you know, there's essentially a move away from communism, isn't there? But I mean, you know...
Yeah, you know, officially it is still a communist country, but it's a very particular form of communism, which is effectively state capitalism.
Yeah.
And so where it was, until, say, 2000, for sake of argument, extremely redistributionist and very much against individuals accumulating any kind of wealth, now it sees individuals accumulating wealth as part of the way it's going to get richer as a country and more powerful.
And actually that does have implications for all of us, doesn't it, to return to our kind of raison d'etre here. Because, you know, even if you're someone who thinks, well, I'm never going to be in the world's richest and I'm never going to be in the world's poorest, I'm somewhere in the middle, you're likely to be impacted by the fact that China is a rising presence. It's a theme we come back to repeatedly on this show. There's more evidence of it, isn't it, whether you work in tourism, manufacturing or anything?
Well, as I always find a way of doing on this podcast is to talk about my speciality subjects. China's presence obviously is gigantic in the tech and now also the motoring world. And these are two of the biggest industries in the world. In the sense of it kind of impacting you, I think if you were to... we know that Chinese companies can pay quite well. And so I think if you've got rising companies, obviously they're very, very big in China at the moment. A lot of them are looking to expand outside of China. That usually has knock-on effects for workers. So even if you've got a 40,000 odd workforce, you know, at the end of the day, the more wealthier companies that are around, it benefits workers at the end of the day.
Gabriel.
I think China is also taking advantage of the fact that it's gone from being this kind of place where you'd outsource cheap labor to a place that really attracts like high-level foreign investment, and capital. Wall Street is now looking at China as like a great point of investment as opposed to, just Apple hiring people in sweatshops.
And it sets the agenda in terms of, taste and demand for products as well, because, it has not only a lot more millionaires, but also more people earning a good living wage who are able to go out and buy things in the market. And so the kind of products, and whether that's films or cars or all of the things we talked about on this podcast, that means that global companies will be catering to those sorts of tastes as much as they are catering to European or North American tastes.
On which I would highly recommend the 300th episode of South Park if you haven't seen it. One last story to come after this. And so, finally this week, it's Cameron's turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Don't worry, car fans, we can still have fun on the autobahn.
What I can't get over, we've driven about 100 kilometers on the autobahn, and I haven't seen one single pothole or divot in the road or anything. Nobody's ever tailgated me. Nobody's given me, not enough space. You never see the people who randomly hit their brakes on the highway for no reason to slow down or whatever. You can just let off the gas. Everybody does that instead. It's just phenomenal.
American YouTuber That Dude in Blue driving along the autobahn in Germany. So, Cameron, you've brought us a car story. Whatever next?
I have, and this week's light-hearted fun story comes in the form of road fatalities. Basically, Germany, for quite a long time now, has been wondering whether to impose speed limits on the mostly unlimited autobahn network. And last week they had a vote on it. The Green Party said that they wanted to have a maximum speed limit of 130 kilometres an hour, which is about 80 miles an hour in English. They lost quite overwhelmingly, actually. It was 2 votes shy of 500 to 126. We still get to drive at full speed on the autobahn.
What's the evidence on either side? Because, one of the things that I learnt in my speed awareness course, and I've been on 2 speed awareness courses, which shows you that the first one wasn't particularly effective. But one of the things I learned on both of those courses was that there are fewer fatalities on the motorways in the UK than there are on smaller roads where people are doing 50 in a 30 zone than when they're doing 120 in a 70 zone or whatever. And that's because obviously you drive differently on a motorway. You're more attentive and there's less pedestrians, obviously. And there's fewer pedestrians, obviously, etc. But in a press interview I saw, the deputy leader of the German Police Officers Union was saying 1 in 4 road deaths could be prevented if there was a speed limit on the autobahn. So which is it?
Yeah, it's really fascinating when it comes to the arguments in this case. Because basically the Green Party, who proposed these changes to start off with, said if we have a speed limit in place, obviously you're going to see less fatalities, you'll also improve traffic flow and reduce emissions, which all sound really quite lovely. The argument against introducing the speed limit seemed to be it's not the German way, because the Germans are really quite proud of the autobahn because they are the only country in Europe that has unlimited stretches of road. When it comes to actual fatalities, you've really got to dig quite deeply into the figures. So you'll see less fatalities on motorways, because you are driving at a higher speed and you are therefore a little bit more attentive if you are doing so. But the roads themselves are far safer. If you were to crash on a motorway, the chances are that you're going to brush up against central reservation or at least pull over to the hard shoulder. Whereas if you crash on a rural road, particularly in England, your runoff area is a tree or a ditch.
One of the reasons that the Green Party suggested implementing this legislation as well was for environmental reasons, because they believed that it would reduce emissions on the autobahn. But one of the things that I noticed when I was doing my research for this is that in May this year, German government, along with Scania, the Swedish trucking company, launched an e-highway between Frankfurt and Darmstadt in Germany, which has overhead wires for electric vehicles. So that's a much better idea, in my opinion, because I don't know, in fact, Holden or Cam, you might have statistics on whether putting a speed limit in would reduce emissions.
It does make quite a difference. So if you're driving at 80 miles per hour, you're likely to be using about 20% more fuel than at 70 miles per hour, which is a big step up for just 10 miles per hour. And the scientific reason for that is that air resistance increases exponentially with speed. So if you double your speed from 40 to 80, you quadruple the amount of energy you need to overcome air resistance.
Okay, so there's a debate. I mean, you've just outlined further there's a debate, but surely at some point someone should say, here's the evidence and here's the right thing to do. Why is no one doing that? Holden.
I do think it's not entirely clear, and that there are a lot of conflicting statistics. German motorways, autobahns, are actually the safest roads in Europe in terms of fatalities, but that may not be connected to the absence of speed limits. It may be because they're built with high-speed driving in mind. So
it's also, I mean, it's very easy to fall on national stereotypes when you talk about this sort of thing. But as a general, character of a people, you'd imagine Germans are possibly more responsible drivers than other European countries. I'm including us in this too.
And they get extensive training before being let out on the roads as well. So their driving tests are actually you get a lot more scrutiny in a driving test in Germany than you would do in Britain. And there's also a lot of agreements that you have on the autobahn as well. So there isn't a speed limit, but there's this, on 70% of roads there's no speed limit, but there's an understanding of where if you're not in the overtaking lane, you usually drive at about 80 miles an hour. It's only in the left lane, which would be our right lane, that you would be going as fast as you want.
Gabriel.
I actually found a bit of research from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which suggested that not only are German highways not the safest in the world, but they're not even among the safest in Europe when it comes to fatalities.
Like
apparently.
it. Fake news, Holden.
So I don't know. No, the thing is, it seems to be a bit torn. Like, as Cam was saying, you do have to dig quite deep. And it does seem to vary according to different criteria. But basically, it said that per billion kilometres travelled on motorways, Germany's fatality rate at 1.6 is twice as high as that of the UK at 0.8.
The UK being the safest?
It's not the safest.
Where was the safest, did they say?
I don't actually know. I think it might have been France. I know that France, Finland, the UK, Portugal, Sweden all had lower fatality rates than Germany.
But what gets really interesting here is, because I looked at those stats as well, but I don't think they take into account the difference between...
That I want to go really, really fast because I like cars.
Yeah, all right, Ollie. I like going fast and I enjoy going on the autobahn.
What didn't they take into account?
I don't think they took into account the differences between a limited section of autobahn and an unlimited. So if you actually look at the breakdown of fatalities on those, it comes to about 67% of fatalities on the roads are on unlimited sections and 33% are on limited,
which matches up to the amount that
precisely. Yeah, exactly.
So it doesn't. You're saying it doesn't make a difference.
It doesn't really make all that much of a difference.
I think we might be falling into the trap of thinking this is about statistics, when actually, rather like our first topic, in Germany at least, I think it's become more about culture and identity.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And so tied in with their car industry as well, of which they're understandably proud.
Yes, in fact, there had to be a sort of gentleman's agreement between the big three German car makers not to engage in an arms race but on building the fastest car, which is now why most even high-speed cars have a limit of fixed, which is it 250 kilometres per hour, Cam?
155 miles an hour.
What because they'd acknowledged that if it went to 400 miles an hour, it would kill someone?
Previously, they had just been this sort of incremental, Mercedes would build a car that could do 160, and then BMW would build one that would do 165. And there was a feeling that this was going to end in disaster and possibly end in a speed limit being imposed. And so, in response to that, they all agreed to abide by this limit.
Cameron, you're saying you enjoy driving fast on the autobahn. Mm-hmm. How fast have you gone, and did you genuinely feel in control? Because we've all sort of put our foot down once to try it and gone to 90 or 100. But actually, when you go to 120, 130 miles per hour, do you feel in control of that vehicle?
It really depends on the car. So I've been on the autobahn twice. I drove to Frankfurt a couple of years ago in a Ford EcoSport, an old one. And any car fans will know that it's a pretty awful car. And even when I got to Frankfurt, I met with Ford, and they said, "You poor bugger, you were driving that car." So I got to about 90, and it was like trying to steer a boat without a rudder. Earlier this year, I was on the autobahn. I got up to about 130 in an Audi RS3, and that was brilliant. Just felt completely planted. And from a driver's perspective, I'm not basing any of this on data, but from a driver's perspective, you're far more alert.
What you can do with motoring journalism, you see. In my opinion.
Yeah, all right. Not of the week, though. You get a great fact of the week. In my opinion, when you're in the fast lane, you're so focused on the road because you're looking to see if someone's going to pull out in front of you. You're always looking in the distance to see where you're going to be going. And if you do need to slow down, you never slam your brakes on. You just lift off and then find a slot to come into.
Okay, so people will use the example of Germany to say, well, we should do this in the UK too. I mean, perhaps not with the roads in the condition they are at the moment, but if we improved our roads and they were smoother, we should have a limitless portion of motorway somewhere. Is that right? Or is it that Germans have become so accustomed to it, there is this cultural understanding, and it would be dangerous here?
I'm going to say this through gritted teeth because while I would love an autobahn here, it wouldn't work. And the reasons are, if you are a lot of the stretches of autobahn in Germany, because the country is so vast, they're usually quite flat. You very rarely get sharp corners, whereas you don't have that in England. All of our motorways are very twisty, they're incredibly bumpy. You know, you make a good point there, Ollie, of where they have grown up with autobahn. Autobahns in their current guise have existed since the 1930s. So, you know, it really has, all of your training of when you're driving is kind of how you would also drive on the autobahn. And I just think that people would completely abuse it in England.
I must say that the final question that producer Sarah has put in the script for me is, why do people need to drive so fast in the first place? Which I think betrays the way a lot of people actually feel about this. Anyone else prepared to admit that actually it all seems a little bit, not to dismiss your boyhood ambitions, Cameron, but a little bit childish just to go faster and faster?
I've never driven a car, so I wouldn't know.
Really?
Nope, never.
If you did, would speed play any part in your desire to do so?
Maybe. I don't know. Probably not. I have no rush to get anywhere.
I think there's definitely a case for reviewing speed limits here because we've had the 70 mile an hour limit on motorways since the 70s and cars have changed a lot since then, braking distances, etc. But also the law is so inconsistently applied that people, I don't think, respect it. So I think there is a good case for saying, let's make it 80 or 85, but then make it very clear that that is the limit and you can't go over it. And then I think you wouldn't have that sense of people who are going at 70 being treated as if they're an obstacle to people who want to be going faster and feel they have a right to get away with going faster.
I suppose the accompanying legislation that a lot of people are looking for is, okay, you can go at 80 or 90 on the motorway, but then you have to go at 20 in residential areas, because there is evidence that says that will kill fewer people.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because you've got people that you can hit in residential areas. So I think everyone plays up this whole idea that I'm a bit kind of like ham-fisted, love getting in cars and driving as quickly as I can, but it's all in moderation. You know, if you are driving in a rural area, slow down. But if you're on a motorway, the best thing to do is focus on the road ahead and not your speedo. And a lot of motorways in Britain have got these average speed checks, which means that you're far more focused on not getting a penalty than looking out for others.
I love the fact that the episode where we do have 3 male contributors has descended into what feels like Top Gear. So at this point, I'm going to say, let's drop the bants. It is on that bombshell, time for us to speed off. But you can take a pit stop at theweek.co.uk to read more, or you can discover our entire back catalogue, perfect for a long drive, when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. In the meantime, my thanks to Cameron Tait, Gabriel Power, and Holden Frith. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, from Broome.